All right, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Blessed Lord our God, our Father in heaven, we thank you so for bringing us around the week again to your holy Shabbat. We thank you for the opportunity to gather together in the shelter of your wings, bathing in the light of your truth. Lord, may our words and our service be pleasing before you this day. Guard us, protect us, and guide us, and open our hearts to receive your word that we might be transformed by it. And I pray this all b'Shem Yeshua. Amen. So this is a special Shabbat, actually, each year. If you will recall, last year I went through a whole series as we looked at the prophets' readings, the Haftorahs, from the 3 weeks of admonition leading up to Tisha B'Av, which is this week, this coming week, is Tisha B'Av, which is when both temples were destroyed. From that point on, there are 7 Shabbats leading to the fall festivals. The first 3 Shabbats that we just talked about are the Sabbaths of admonition, and the remaining 7 are the Sabbaths of comfort. Comfort my people. This one has a special name. It is the Shabbat Chazon, the Sabbath of vision, because the Haftorah portion is from Isaiah, vision, which reminds me I need to clean my glasses. It looks forward, actually, to a vision of the future. I hope today we can kind of see that the texts that we are to study this week lead us to that. So we've finished the book of Numbers, Bamidbar. And we've come to this next book, the 5th book of the Torah, which we know as Deuteronomy. And as Weston pointed out, that word means second law in Greek. But as you know by now, hopefully if you listen to me, that's not how it's known in Hebrew. Jews refer to it as Sefer HaDevarim, based on a word in the first verse of the entire book. Ele HaDevarim asher dever Moshe al Yisrael. These are the words that Moshe spoke to Israel. So this is known as HaDevarim, the words, the book of the words. In common usage, to simply call it Devarim. When you think of that Torah scroll, think of it as one 34-foot long scroll that is a continuous poem or song. One would read it and hear it often, each week, in fact. It's meant to be studied continuously so that, as it says, it is very near to you, that it is in your mouth and in your heart so that you may observe it. In the process of reading that scroll and seeing it, we'll lay it out at the end of the High Holy Days. And you'll see it's broken into divisions just by spacing. But they won't have neat, easy chapter divisions or verse numbers because that's not in the scroll. Instead, you recognize the sections by the words that are in them. You have an experience with this. This is how you know things. If I said, "Oh, say, can you see?" you know exactly what I'm talking about. You know exactly what verse it is in exactly what song. Or if I said, "The rocket's red glare," you'd know where we are in the national anthem. This is how Jews learn the Torah. You learn the words, you learn it as a song, and so when a verse pops up or a word, you know where it is. That's why it's known. Not chapter by chapter. The name we know it by, Deuteronomy, has come from a translation, Hebrew to Greek, Greek to Latin, Latin to English. And because it's called second law, some have been mistaken to think of it as a second set of laws, but it really is not. It's a great oration by Moses that reviews and expounds and explains the set of mitzvot and commands and all those things that he received in face-to-face encounters with God himself. Moses' role was an intermediary and a teacher, and it had a pattern to it. First of all, he was in the cloud, face-to-face with the very presence of God, on the mountain where he received this direct teaching from Adonai. Then he would turn and go to the children of Israel and teach those words, transmit those words to them. Here's an example of it. You can go back through and see these large sections in the Torah. In Exodus chapter 25 through 31, you have a ringside seat in the cloud with Moses and Adonai to hear the exact words of the instruction that Moses received for building the tabernacle and for its service. Then in Exodus chapters 35 through 39, Moses is in the camp at the foot of the mountain, sharing these commands with the children of Israel. Then you go to chapter 40, and that records the actual construction of the tabernacle. So this is how it goes. Moses in the cloud, Moses coming to the people, and then the implementation. In Leviticus, the kavod, the glory of Adonai, filled the newly constructed tabernacle, the tent of meeting. And now Moses received the commands of Leviticus coming from the tent. But again, Leviticus reports the commands received from the tent, and then Moses shared these words with the first generation from Egypt. No longer is God transmitting from the mountain. Now he's dwelling among them, and Moses is the intermediary. This situation appertains until God begins leading them towards the promised land. In Numbers chapter 10, verses 11 through 13, it tells us, on the 20th day of the second month of the second year, the cloud lifted up from the tabernacle of the testimony. Then Bnei Israel set out on their travels in the Sinai wilderness. The cloud came to rest in the wilderness of Paran, so they set out the first time by the mouth of Adonai and by Moses' hand. Now, what I call the wilderness yeshiva, God's school where he is teaching the children of Israel. The wilderness yeshiva became mobile. That's why the tabernacle was mobile. We talked about it last week. Each point on the journey was first a destination, and then after they had been there a bit, it became a starting point for their next leg. It's shortly after this happened in chapter 12 and 13 of Numbers that it brings disaster, and that entire first generation is condemned to die in the wilderness because of the event with the spies. They were condemned not to enter the promised land. Moses' teaching must now shift again. Now the mobile yeshiva will focus on teaching the next generation of Israelites. Along the way, Moses will also learn that he is barred from entering the promised land. These two events made the book of Devarim absolutely necessary. And there's one more point to notice also in Numbers chapter 11, verse 16. It tells us, Adonai said to Moses, bring me 70 of the elders of Israel, whom you know to be elders of the people and their leaders. Take them to the tent of meeting so they may stand with you there. This is the selection of the wilderness Sanhedrin, the elders who would have the responsibility to interpret Torah. The text said they stood with Moses at the tent of meeting. This would become the general order for the rest of the wilderness experience. The anointed, selected elders would have the front row positions when Moses would teach what he got directly from God. All through the remaining 38 years, Moses must do his level best to prepare the second generation for their responsibility to carry the truth of the revealed God. They will have to establish God's chosen kingdom on earth and begin the eternal relationship of the children of Jacob and Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. In Deuteronomy and Devarim, then, Moses has stopped at the very gate of the promised land. In the plains of Moab, the low places by the river, on the east side of the Jordan, that's where he begins this urgent teaching which must take the revelation on Mount Sinai and bring it down to the plain of Moab. He must clarify and make certain of their understanding before he passes the leadership on to God's chosen successors, Yehoshua ben Nun, Joshua son of Nun, and the 70 elders who were anointed. Deuteronomy, Devarim, then is Moses the teacher, the lawgiver, giving his final farewell. His purpose is to emphasize and properly interpret the Torah to the leadership of the second generation of post-Egypt Israelites. It will be their responsibility to sit as the first Sanhedrin and interpret the Torah in all cases brought before them. The text clarifies this. In the 40th year, on the 11th month, on the first day of the month, after he had struck down Sihon, king of the Amorites, and who lived in Heshbon, and Og, king of Bashan, who lived in Ashtaroth and Edrei, across the Jordan in the land of Moab, it says, Moses began to explain this Torah, saying, that word is ba'ar, means to make plain or to make clear. So he began to make clear the Torah. One of the characteristics that stands out in the book of Deuteronomy helps us to see that this is Moshe giving a very lengthy sermon, and it is the way that topics are introduced. The wording is very different in Devarim. Recall that throughout the books of Shemot, Exodus, Vayikra, Leviticus, and Bamidbar, Numbers, dozens of sections begin with this Hebrew phrase, Vayedaber Adonai al Moshe ve'omer deber al bnei Yisrael. And Adonai spoke to Moshe, saying, speak to the children of Israel. Many sections, numerous times, is in the Torah. These books documented the very words that God spoke to Moses, as those words say, as intermediary to the children. But now, here in Devarim, the text begins with the words we heard earlier today. Ele ha-devarim asher deber Moshe al kol Yisrael. These are the words that Moshe spoke. Moshe spoke to all Israel. And throughout the text, Moshe is retelling all the teaching that God had given to him. No longer do we see the phrase Adonai spoke to Moses saying, speak to the children of Israel. So the text has shifted from documenting the specific conversations between God and Moses to documenting Moses' teaching, making clear the Torah. This is evidence of the transition that the nation of Israel is going through. The book of Devarim starts at a time of great transition. Transitions are key points where the nature of the teaching changes in order to accomplish a slightly different purpose. Moses knows that he will no longer lead Israel. Joshua will. Furthermore, the second generation has come of age and stands on the precipice of crossing the Jordan to receive the Abrahamic promise, which has been anticipated for 500 years. Transitions can be terrifying and disconcerting. And a good way to relieve that fear is to remind someone that they have experienced change before. Therefore, Moses tells the leadership of the second generation, Adonai our God, this is Deuteronomy 1, verse 6. Adonai our God spoke to us at Horeb, saying, you have stayed long enough at this mountain. You've stayed long enough at this mountain, he said. Here at the beginning of his sermon, Moses is clarifying for us what happened at the mountain, which we just read about. I just read to you from Numbers chapter 10, verses 11 and 13. Only this time, Moses is giving us a detail that we didn't previously know. That is, God said to you, you stayed long enough at this place. You go back to Numbers 10 and it won't say that. Moses is clarifying something that we didn't know previously. God had decided it was time for their situation to change. So here at the plains of Moab, on the precipice of one of the great transitions, Moses is reminding them, hey, you've gone through transitions before. Remember, we were camped out at the foot of the mountain and everything was pretty good, and then God said it's time to move. That was a transition. Here's another transition you're about to go into. God had imparted all the teaching of the latter part of Exodus and the book of Leviticus while Israel stayed at the foot of the mountain. It was a year or more that they were there. God decided that they were ready to proceed by stages from the foot of the mountain to the next stage through all the lessons he had in store for them, leg by leg. Thus, the cloud lifted and they began the nomadic portion of their wilderness education. They began moving as an army so that discipline might be instilled. Flexibility was gained moving from place to place. One couldn't get too comfortable in any one place because they were only there for a short while. God remained central to their lives, moving ahead of them and selecting the site for their next lesson and then dwelling among them in the center of camp. This went on for a bit more than 38 years, which brings us back to this moment in Devarim, the plains of Moab on the east side of the Jordan. The book of Devarim shows us how Moses called on these 38 years of key lessons to prepare them for settling the promised land. They must learn to function in tribal units now, separated from one another. They must begin to develop communication and stability of a nation whose components are distant from one another. First at Shiloh and finally at Jerusalem, these will become the key places in maintaining the stability of the central focus of God. And we do this to this day. We turn and face Jerusalem. The leaders will need to arise to the responsibility of interpreting Torah for day-to-day living while not losing sight of the calling of the Jewish people. The eternal and unchanging Torah must be the central foundation of their lives. It has lessons in it, whether one is camped at the foot of the mountain, whether one is moving like an army in stages throughout the desert, or entering and conquering a land, or settling a land, or living as a nation with tribes separated into provinces. The big picture view of Moses, the intermediary and teaching, his intermediary and teaching ministry goes something like this. Moses begins his teaching ministry on the mountain, receiving the word from God. Then he shares it at the base of the mountain. Then he takes his teaching into the mobile classroom of the wilderness. And then finally, at the edge of a major transition, he gives a great drash, a great teaching to the leadership, an interpretation of Torah in the plains of Jordan. This is the pattern of Moses and the children of Israel in the Torah in the wilderness yeshiva. So now, with that as our foundational understanding, let's move on and consider the gospel texts, also Jewish texts, and the ministry of Yeshua, the prophet like Moses. The gospel writers ensured that the pattern of Moses in the wilderness is echoed in the text they left for us. Thus, we would come to recognize that the prophet like Moses came with the same pattern and a similar purpose. In his mountaintop prayers, Yeshua also communed one-on-one with God. He too teaches the people at a mountain. Then he too selects those that would continue his mission into the future, that is, his apostles. Then he teaches these apostles. Like Moses, Yeshua must prepare his people for another transition, dispersion, going into the lands of the nations. Yeshua knew that the Romans would destroy the temple and scatter his precious flock. In Matthew 24, he tells his students, "Do you see all these things? Amen, I tell you, not one stone will remain upon another." He sees the temple's destruction. And as we noted last week in John chapter 4, verses 21 through 24, when talking to the Samaritan woman at the well, he says that a time is coming when no one will worship either in Samaria or in Jerusalem, because he knew what would happen to the promised land under the ruthless Romans. Knowing all this, Yeshua guided his students, who would be the leaders of the movement after his ascension, as to how they live the ethics of the Torah while living among the nations. His teaching takes the same Torah given in the wilderness and interprets it in order to prepare them for living in exile. He prepares his people to live in a new way. Someday, he will restore Jerusalem, but until then, his apostles have a job to do. They must teach that we ourselves become like stones in the temple. That's the teaching of Yeshua's chief student, Simon, we call Peter. Yeshua will teach that our relationship with our brother is as important as the offerings at the temple. Yeshua will teach that purity required of the temple priesthood is also required of us, but it is the things which come out of the heart which defile us more than any earthly defilement could. Things like evil intentions, sexual immorality, theft, murder, and many more like them. Yeshua will inspire Paul to teach repeatedly about putting off the old defiled person and putting on the new one who seeks relationship with God and expresses it in his relationship with his fellow man. Exile happened before to the Jewish people, but this time it would be a bit different. This time, in addition to carrying the Torah with them, they would carry the good news of the fulfillment of the Abrahamic promise to the nations and the teaching of the prophet like Moses to be our light in the darkness. Like Moses, Yeshua would make clear the teachings of the Torah so that we would know how to live towards God and towards each other. Let's look at the echoes of the wilderness yeshiva in the gospel text. God gave the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai in the hearing of all the children. This is Exodus chapter 20. Chapter 21 is God telling Moses about the mishpatim and the judgments which are based on the 10. Then he goes on for 3 chapters. Then in Exodus 24, 1 through 4, we read the following. Then to Moses he said, "Come up to Adonai, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 elders of Israel, and worship from afar. Moses alone is to approach Adonai, but the others may not draw near, nor are the people to go up with him." So Moses came and told the people all the words of Adonai, as well as all the ordinances. All the people answered with one voice and said, "All the words which Adonai has spoken, we will do." Kol devarim. So Moses wrote down all the words of Adonai, then rose up early in the morning and built an altar below the mountain, along with 12 pillars for the 12 tribes of Israel. This is a few short verses. That's only 4 verses, but there's a whole lot of stuff in it. First, God is gathering Moses and Aaron and his sons, as well as 70 elders for a special encounter. Secondly, Moses went down to the children of Israel and taught them the words in chapters 20 through 23. Third, Israel accepted the teaching. Fourth, Moses wrote 5 chapters of the Torah scroll. And fifth, he built an altar with the 12 pillars representing each of them. I'd like to focus on 2 things from that in particular. First, the teaching Moses gave is teaching which begins to put flesh on the bones of the 10 Commandments. It is in a very real way interpreting the 10 Commandments for specific situations in life. That is what the Torah of chapters 21 through 23 does. And the second thing I'd like you to notice is that those that would be responsible for keeping this teaching alive and judging according to it are being gathered and selected. The chief priests and the elders are being selected by God to be, in essence, the students of Moses. God had decided that Moses would be the vessel through which the teaching of God would come. Aaron and the Sanhedrin were being set apart as the chief disciples of Moses. Now let's turn to the New Covenant, the Brit Hadashah scriptures, and see if we don't see this pattern. In Matthew chapter 4, verses 18 through 22, it shows us that Yeshua went through Galilee and began what? Gathering students for a very special traveling rabbinic yeshiva. First, Shimon and Andres, then Yaakov and Yochanan, Jacob and John. Then chapter 5 begins with this. You know this very well. Now, when Yeshua saw the crowds, he went up to the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him, and he opened his mouth and began to teach them, saying. And of course, that's the Beatitudes. Profoundly beautiful teaching is the Sermon on the Mount. This is all from Matthew chapter 5. It begins with, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God." And it includes the call to be salt and light, which we talked about today. His famous declaration regarding fulfilling the Torah to its fullest. Reconciling with our brothers we have offended. His teaching interprets Torah as a chassid, that is going beyond the Torah with respect to adultery. Remember, if you've looked at a woman lustfully, you've committed adultery in your heart. With respect to divorce, with respect to oaths, turning the other cheek, love your enemy, and so much more in this defining teaching of Yeshua on the Sermon on the Mount. All the teachings that, if implemented in our lives, will ensure that we are living by the marvelously godly ethics of the Torah. And this can be done wherever you are, whether you are in Israel with the temple standing, or dispersed to the corners of the earth, living among the Gentile nations. Yeshua's teaching means that his disciples can carry the weightier things of the Torah, justice, mercy, and faithfulness, with them anywhere into the world. And please take note how the author of the Gospel of Matthew has succeeded in bringing forth the echoes of the Exodus. Yeshua first gathers his students, then draws them to the top of the mountain, then shares with them the most critical teaching of the Torah of Messiah. That is the Sermon on the Mount. We don't know if Matthew wrote this before or after the destruction of the temple, but we do know that his great teacher had told him it would be destroyed. Therefore, Matthew knew that Israel was in for another transition, and what better way to prepare them than to echo Moses in the Exodus in the book of Matthew. Remind them, you've been through transitions before. Now, Matthew was not the only gospel writer to bring up echoes of the Exodus story. The Gospel of Luke similarly sought to connect the teaching of Yeshua to Israel's formative years in the wilderness. But Luke views it from a slightly different angle. Like Matthew, Luke seems to wants us to recall a transition, but instead of the mountain, he focuses on the scene in Deuteronomy, Moses' final teaching on the plains of Moab. You heard Chris read from Luke chapter 6 today. Please note the echoes of the Exodus here. Verse 12, Yeshua starts out talking to his Father on the mountain. Verse 13, Yeshua gathers his students and selects from among them those that will take over the leadership of the school in order to teach his Torah to the world. Verse 14 is a more extensive list, including all 12, a number equal to the number of tribes of Israel, thus implying representation of the entire house of Israel. Verse 17 tells us, then Yeshua came down with them and stood at a level place, stood on the plain. Luke very intentionally uses the phrase translated here as level place or plain in order to bring back echoes of Moses on the plains of Moab, giving the book of Deuteronomy, a critical foundational text of the people, an echo in the Gospels. The text then tells us that he came down with them to this plain and they were talking to large crowds. This echoes the way Moses taught with the chosen successors nearest to him. Yeshua's apostles were nearest to him, and the rest of the children of Israel spreading out from there. Only here we see the point that Luke is trying to make. The Torah of Messiah is given to the apostles, but the message is intended for a broader audience, including both Jews and Gentiles. Judah and Jerusalem are mentioned in this reading, but you also heard the regions of Tyre and Sidon also mentioned. So this Torah of Messiah is meant not only for the Jewish people, but also for the nations of the world. And what follows is a second version of the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount. One could almost say a Deutero Sermon on the Mount. Not word for word, the same as Matthew, but beautifully presented and poetically organized. The underlying Hebrew has a rhythm and a cadence reminiscent of Hebrew liturgy. The Sermon on the Mount was directed to the third person, blessed is he, whereas Luke's Sermon on the Plain is much more personal. Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of heaven. And the same with the counterpoint. Woe to you who are rich, for you are receiving your comfort in full. Then the same teachings in slightly different words. One notable addition in this is verse 39 through 40. He spoke with a parable to them. The blind cannot show the way to the blind, can he? Won't they both fall into the pit? A disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like his teacher. This parable could easily be understood as warning his audience to learn only from these apostles and not from those that are blind to Yeshua's message. We would do well to take note of that even today. Not everyone with internet access and a self-proclaimed title is teaching the truth. You know, Jack Zimmerman was up here when he visited a few weeks ago. He noted the scariest words to him as a Messianic rabbi are, I have a message from God for you. Do you remember that? I share that. But I'm actually more scared by another phrase. I follow Rabbi X on YouTube. His teaching is rock solid. I don't want to hear that. Yeshua says everyone who is fully trained will be like his teacher. He was intending that people should listen to his apostles and not no one else, not anyone else. We should ask, who was Rabbi X's teacher before we start listening to him? And what did they teach? Anyway, that's an aside. Matthew and Luke both knew their audience. Although the exact date of when the Gospels were written is not clearly known, most scholars date it to the last quarter of the first century. And as Galileans, the authors lived right on the edge of the diaspora. Galilee was primarily Jewish, but had a good admixture of Romans and Greeks and Syrians. Go much further to the north or to the east of Galilee, and you are outside the Jewish promised land. That is into the diaspora. For the sake of God's creation, Yeshua's good news must go out to the ends of the earth. So with the help of the Ruach HaKodesh, Matthew and Luke wrote texts that bring the truth of Mount Sinai, that is the truth of heaven, down to the mountain and the plain, which really means to each and every heart that hears the words of Yeshua. The Sermon on the Mount, the Sermon on the Plain, both hold the greatest teaching of Messiah. The message they hold began its journey with the leadership of Yeshua's apostles, his Talmudim, his students. And they carried that yeshiva teaching into the diaspora beyond, so that the Torah of Messiah and the good news of the Abrahamic promise would reach all the families of the earth as intended. The teaching of these sermons force every human being to encounter God. The lineal trace of these sermons has its source in God sitting on his throne in heaven. The Torah flowed down first through Moses, then the children of Israel, and finally to each and every human heart. The vessels that carried God's instructions started with Moses and was carried down by all his successors, from Joshua and the elders to the prophets, and finally to Yeshua and to his apostles. Along the way, it was interpreted and elucidated until finally this greatest teacher, Yeshua, brought the very essence of what God had been saying for thousands of years into clear focus. I quoted from this late scholar before, Pinchas Lapid. He said in his book, The Sermon on the Mount, A Utopia or a Call to Action. He said this: Jesus is in no way anti-Moses to Matthew, but rather one who carries on from Moses, who had begun to expound the teachings of Sinai in his own time. Many have looked at these sermons and thought of them as either impossible to attain or a utopic, a utopian dream, or as a means of showing us how inadequate we are, but these assertions they all miss the mark. The Torah of Messiah was not given as an exercise in elegant oratory. No, it is meant to be a guide to life. If it seems aspirational, that is the point. We are to always strive to live as Yeshua taught. It is in the striving and the self-discipline and the practice that these sermons call us to emulate, where we find freedom from a futile life lived towards vain pursuits of the ordinary world. Instead, it is in the striving that we begin to experience a life driven by the Spirit, by the Ruach HaKodesh, towards spiritual renewal. As he said, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied." Yeshua's chosen students and emissaries were, as he said, fully trained, and therefore like their teacher, Peter, John, Yaakov, Jude, Matthew, all left behind texts for us, each one having been fully trained. And Paul, called later on, left us many texts also. All of these texts elucidate the Torah of Messiah for inclusion into our daily lives. Just as Moses made clear the Torah from the mountain to the seekers of his generation, the line traces from Mount Sinai to each succeeding generation. Then Yeshua came and brought that teaching down to the plane of human existence. On a plane, there are no landmarks, so one must have a way of orienting oneself. One that is not seen or tangible, like the magnetic field that the compass needle points to. For Yeshua, this intangible force that our inner compass is to be directed by is very simply put in one word: love. The love of God, the love of neighbor permeates the sermons and indeed all the teaching of Yeshua's fully trained students. Our endeavor here is to continually immerse ourselves in these texts, the texts of the Tanakh and the Brit Hadashah, so that we can navigate the plane of human existence drawn by this magnetic force of love. Love towards one another is how we express our love towards God. It is on the map of the Torah of Messiah. It's probably appropriate then that we are speaking of this on Shabbat Chazon, the vision of Isaiah, because Isaiah saw clearly Yeshua and saw clearly all the things that we are to live by. If we honestly look at the Sermon on the Mount and not treat it as scary or impossible to attain, but try it in each and every little minor detail of our lives, the next step you take, the next word you speak, the next interaction you have, only then will we be drawn to live a life that Yeshua intends for us, because we're heading for a great transition. Those apostles were the vessels that carried that good news out to the world. It's here. It's in your hearts. It's in your mouths. Now you get to be the vessels to carry this through until that great day when the shofar sounds and we turn to Jerusalem and note that our Messiah has returned. And that is certain. That's not something to worry about. That is certain in our future. May we all live as he intended. Let me go to the Lord in prayer. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, creator of all things. You have told us, Lord, that this is the Sabbath of vision. We seek in your word and listen to the words of the prophets and listen to the prophet like Moses. And we see a glorious future. I pray, Lord, that you will strengthen us and help us to carry that good news with us and to share it with all those who need it. I pray that you'll help us to live in harmony and unity, showing the love that you poured out for us to one another. And Lord, help us stand strong in our faith. And I pray this all, B'Shem Yeshua. Amen.